We're going to be doing the first 10 verses. First 10 verses of James chapter 4. So, starting in verse 1. James is writing, he says in verse 1, "Where do wars and fights come from among you? Do they not come from your desires for pleasure that war in your members? It says, you lust and do not have, you murder and covet and cannot obtain, you fight and war, yet you do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask amiss, that you may spend it on your pleasures." It says, "Adulterers and adulteresses, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Whoever therefore wants to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. Or do you think the scripture says in vain, the Spirit who dwells in us yearns jealously, but he gives more grace? Therefore he says, God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Therefore submit to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Lament and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned to mourning and your joy to gloom. Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord, and he will lift you up." James got some hard words in there this morning. When we come to seeing this, obviously we're a little separated from the last time we were in James, obviously from the celebration of Easter and the remembrance on Good Friday. But a few weeks back when we were in James, and we were in James 3, James was building this contrast between worldly wisdom and heavenly wisdom. Basically what the world would tell you to do and what God would tell you to do. He's like, there's a difference here. He's like, not everything you hear is the right way. Not everything is what God would tell you and what God would have you do and how God would have you live your life. We talked about there's a really important divide to be seen there. Because then seeing that divide and knowing that there's a contrast there leads us to, well, now we need to know what's on the right side of this. We need to know what's on the right side of this and what's on the wrong side of this. So James takes a pretty hard line. James takes a pretty hard line on the subject matter this morning. But let's take a look at what he says. And the first thing that I want us to consider as we're breaking down this passage this morning, he's talking about relationship issues, he's talking about problems, he's talking about perspective issues, but he starts sharing with us what the source of many of our relationships problems are. The source of many of our relationship problems. And he's talking about this in these first verses, and he's like, where do these wars and fights come from among you? And like, why are these things here? So he begins to describe, the primary source of many of our relationship problems. And when we think about these things, we think about the relationships we have with people. We think about the problematic situations we're in. Maybe the problematic situations we're in the middle of right now. I don't know. But when we think about relationship problems, and I'm not just talking about, with our spouse, but with our friends, with our neighbors, with our, family, with our community, maybe other people sitting in here as our church family. And I'm not looking for answers. It's a rhetorical question. Like, what sort of things would we point to as like the sources of the relationship problems that we end up seeing? Like, what are the types of things that we would kind of pinpoint and be like, oh, those are the sources of the problems. Like, that's why I have this problem with these people. Maybe it's, as we observe those things, maybe it's, well, this person did this thing, or this person said this thing, or like I could just tell by the way that they're talking that, they've got some sort of thing going on, so I'm holding it against them. Maybe it's, watching somebody get something or get, attention or something that you feel you deserve, and that other person's being shown these things, but you're not. And so that creates kind of friction there. I mean, there's all sorts of, like, we think of, just in our, small relationships, sometimes it's, what's for dinner tonight? I mean, there's just dumb things too that can lead to relationship problems. Sometimes it's, money. Sometimes it's, we got different opinions on things. Lots of different things. But, a lot of the things that I mentioned and a lot of things that maybe we would point to in some of those things, I think a lot of those are, the problems I see in other people that cause the relationship problems that they have with me. I'm evaluating what other people have done to cause these relationship problems. But when we see what James is talking about this morning, James is calling us really to some self-reflection and some self-evaluation. Again, we say, what's the source of many of our relationship problems? Again, let me read verse 1 and 2 again. It says, where do wars and fights come from among you? He's like, so there's people here, it's you, it's other people. Where do the wars and the fights come from? Do they not come from your desires for pleasure that war inside of yourself or in your members? It says, you lust and do not have, you murder and covet and cannot obtain, you fight and war, yet you do not have because you do not ask. Obviously, James starts by posing the question. It's like, where do these wars and fights come from? He's like, think about it. Where do they come from? You see that he points there. He points to really an internal battle that's going on. He's like, there's a battle going on inside of you because you want things. You want to be viewed this way. Like there's, different, he puts in here pleasures, and we'll talk a little bit more about that word. He's like, there's these different things that you're wanting, and internally you're struggling over these things, and potentially somebody else may speak into that or just have some different, part of that equation. But it's like, there's a battle going on inside of you. He's like, you want this, you want these things. That word there for pleasure is interesting. I don't know if you've ever heard the word hedonism. It's not, again, it's one of those words. This is the English word, but this English word is derived from the word that was used originally here. But it's the word hedonism. And that's what that word pleasure, the word that we have for hedonism now comes from that word. But what is hedonism? If you've never heard of it, this concept of hedonism is a belief that pleasure and happiness is the chief goal of life. Like my chief goal is to make sure that I just live this life to experience the most pleasure and happiness that I can. That is what hedonism is. This is the word that is translated from here. In verse 1, it talks about that internal struggle. It talks about the internal struggle of our flesh that just wants to focus on having those pleasures and seeking that happiness. Verse 2 shows us how that spills out towards other people. It says, you lust and you do not have. You murder and covet and cannot obtain. You fight in war, yet you do not have because you do not ask. And now maybe for us, maybe not with such dramatic words of, lust, murder, covet, fight, war. Like maybe those aren't the descriptors of our current relationship situations. Maybe they are in some ways, possibly. There's likely pieces of all of those elements. I mean, Jesus even relates to like, if you hate somebody, you've essentially, in my mind, you've murdered. It's like murder. That level of hate is, Jesus relates those things. And so there's elements of that are probably within us in our relationships. The reality is that when we're driven, like when the drive within us is wanting our own way, getting that next thing, envying what other people have, letting greed and selfishness take control. Like we may feel like, well, I'm not extreme in any of those things, but there's probably parts of those things going on. And when we let those types of things lead the way, when hedonism is my chief goal is pleasure and happiness, it leads to conflict with others. And notice again, James says, and that starts inside of you. It doesn't necessarily start with that other person. The heart issue, the source issue. James is like, you got to stop and take a look at your own self. self-evaluation time. And that's not, of course, saying that there's no problems that exist in other people and then results of in our relationship problems, because they have the same problems that we do. But I think of something like, when Paul was talking to young Timothy in the letters that he wrote to Timothy, he made a strong statement to him. He's like, as far as it depends on you, as far as you are able, you as an individual need to do everything you can to live at peace with the people around you. He's like, don't worry about other people yet. You start with you. You start with, you need to do everything you can to live at peace with those around you. James isn't the only one that shares things such as this and talks about these things. I think we were in there recently, but I want to go once again and I want to look at Galatians 5 together. Galatians 5. I know it wasn't that long ago that we were here, but there's a lot of parallels in the presentation of Galatians 5 and what we're seeing in James 4. Galatians 5, starting in verse 16. It says, I say then, walk in the Spirit, and you shall not fulfill the lust of the flesh. For the flesh lusts against the Spirit, and the Spirit against the flesh. And these are contrary to one another, so that you do not do the things that you wish. But if you are led by the Spirit, you are not under the law. It says, now the works of the flesh are evident, which are adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lewdness, idolatry, sorcery, hatred, contentions, jealousies, outbursts of wrath, selfish ambitions, dissensions, heresies, envy, murder, drunkenness, revelries, and the like, of which I tell you beforehand, just as I told you in the time past, that those who practice such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Against such there is no law. And those who are Christ have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. If we live in the Spirit, let us also walk in the Spirit. Let us not become conceited, provoking one another, envying one another. Now again, you begin to see some parallels as we just read through this. The whole first part of this, in verse 16 through 18, it talks about that internal struggle that's going on. It says the Spirit inside of you is at war with the flesh that is you. It's like there is a war that is going on inside. It says, if we have the Spirit of God inside of you, then the Spirit of God would lead us towards the things of God. But we still live in this body of flesh that strongly desires to lead us to all of the wrong places. Again, like when we are saved by Christ, we are redeemed from the soul level, but we are not fully changed at the flesh level yet. That will not happen until we stand before Him in heaven, when we have a new body that is not, that is not infected with sinfulness. But where we stand right now, as a human being, if you're saved by Jesus, is that you do have the Spirit of God inside of you. And the Spirit of God is leading you. If you will follow Him, He is leading you to walk in the ways of God. But always and constantly, there is a war going on inside of every single one of us where our flesh is like, but you could have that. But you could do that. Look at that person's making me angry. Let me hold it against them. Let me be bitter. Let me be angry. Let me have those relationship problems. Let me build my life with the sole purpose of seeking pleasure and happiness, disregarding what God would have me do. Let me focus on all of those things. Again, there's a war going on in every single one of us, and we would be foolish to ignore the fact that that war is going on, because then it leads us to understand, I know why I'm desiring these things, but is that what God has for me? I know where some of these problems are coming from. They're the bystanding casualties of the war that's going on. It's like I understand how this is working. When Paul is writing to the Galatians, he talks about that internal battle that is going on. But then you see, and he kind of goes on, he says, the works of the flesh are evident. Now, this is, if the flesh wins, If we let the flesh win, that battle's going on. If the flesh gets any chance to win in that war, he says, this is what happens when the flesh wins. And he starts giving this whole list of things that when the flesh wins, this happens. And we talk about the relationship problems that we're talking about this morning. When the flesh wins, it says there's hatred and contentions and jealousies and outbursts of wrath, selfish ambitions, arguments, envy, all of these things that happen. It's like when the flesh wins, these things are expected. And so when we look at ourselves right now, when we look at where we're at, when we look at the relationships that we have with others and how we interact with others, maybe some of those problems that are occurring now, it's like, are we letting the flesh win that is leading to those issues happening? And maybe some person had some other part to play in where we're at right now. But when I look at my own self-evaluation, have I been letting the flesh win in regards to this moment and these things that are going on? Because that's what happens. Like, those are the expectations. It's like, in any battle, there's the flow of war. You take land this way, you take land this way, and, keep moving forward. Hopefully for us, the Spirit keeps winning because we keep following him. And we continually move forward, and we take more land, and more days are better. We're not messing up as much, and we're progressing, and we're growing, and we're following more and more in line with the Spirit of God. Like, that's what this is supposed to look like. But when we let the flesh win, that's what it looks like. And he goes on to tell us what to expect when the Spirit's winning. If we are following the Spirit, if the war is going his way, if we are following after him, then the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, long-suffering, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, self-control, gentleness. Those are the things that should be coming out of our life as a result of following in his ways and being on the right side of the battle. Because sometimes we're the ones that's like, yeah, I want the flesh stuff. I want the flesh stuff right now. Like, I want what I want. I want to live for me. Pleasure, happiness. That's what I'm about. God, yeah, I'll give you Sunday morning. Sometimes that's where we're at. And we're letting him win every week. It's like, God's not just, I'll take the battle for an hour and a half on Sunday. He's like, this is mine all the time because you are mine. And why are you still giving in to this other stuff? And then sometimes when we have these problems going on, we start blaming other people because we fail to acknowledge it. It's like, man, the roots of this at the end of the day are still within me because I haven't done the best that I could do to live at peace with all people. So, again, there's so much parallel in a passage like this that's talking about that internal struggle that all of us have going on. But when we look at some of these things, and we see these kind of interpersonal relationship issues, or maybe just all the things of life that we get caught up in, sometimes we, I think, miss the fact that we have even bigger relationship issues than we realize. Look at these next verses back in James 4 if you turned away from it. Give you a minute to get back there. But James 4, maybe we have even bigger relationship issues than we realize. Again, starting in verse 3, James 4, it says, "You ask and do not receive because you ask amiss, that you may spend it on your pleasures." James, hard words. He says, adulterers, adulteresses, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Whoever therefore wants to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. Or do you think the scripture says in vain, the Spirit who dwells in us yearns jealously? What we can't miss, and I hope we don't miss, is that the life that we're living, in all of our interpersonal relationships, all the things that are going on, the choices that we're making, whether we're choosing to live the way of the flesh, whether we're following in step with the Spirit of God, all of these things are playing out within the umbrella of the relationship that we have with our God. And I think sometimes we fail to look up above the immediate issues that are right around us. It's like, I got these problems with people. I've got these focuses in my life that aren't going the right way. I'm, messing up maybe in some of these ways or whatever's going on. But then I fail to see that, how is this affecting the relationship that I have with him? How is it affecting that? Even in verse 3, you see this thing. He's like, you got all these problems going on. And now then you start talking to God about it. He's like, you start asking him for things. You ask and you do not receive. And he says, and some of this, maybe we've been guilty of this. It's like, oh, I come to God, and you think, oh, it's great that you come to God, but I come to God just, God, would you give me this? Would you give me that? And these are all the things that I want. Like, again, we've talked about this before. We go, don't treat God like a vending machine. He is not a vending machine. He blesses us. You woke up and started breathing this morning. You have a future to look forward to that is so beyond anything you could possibly imagine, or greater than any pleasure you can ever find in this world. That's the promise that he has given you. And yet sometimes we're still like, oh, God, it'd be really nice if I just had this and these things, and if you just take care of my money issues and all of these things. James is like, he's like, sometimes you're going to him and you're asking and you're not receiving because you're asking for the wrong things. He's like, you ask amiss. He's like, you're asking for things to fulfill what your flesh wants. He's like, you're asking for the sake of your pleasures, not to be in line with what God would have you do. He's like, you're asking God to fulfill your fleshly pleasures. Like, that's not what he's about. He's like, and thus you do not receive. And then James, like I just said a minute ago, James decides to take the hard line. He goes so far as he's like, adulterers and adulteresses. When he's talking about this subject, he's like, you've got these relationship issues going on. You've got these different perspectives. You've got this war between your flesh and the spirit. And James comes to this point, he's basically like, you bunch of cheaters. He's like, he's supposed to be your one. You say you love him. He's the one. All of these things, you're going to live for him. You're devoted to him. You follow him. He saved you. All of these things. And yet you still keep going back. And yet you still keep going back to all of these things that he says we're not about anymore. That's not to say we need to live impoverished and all these things, but they're not the focus. They're not the goal. They're not any of those things. And, I think of the moment when Jesus is talking to the rich young ruler. Sometimes people don't think about how serious God is in following him. Like, I think he's serious to the point that if there is anything in the way of your relationship with him, then it is worth giving up. To the point where, like, when he talked to the rich, when Jesus was having that personal conversation with that guy that we just referenced as the rich young ruler, Jesus knew that the one thing holding him back, I mean, he knew more in depth, I'm sure, but the one thing he tackled in that moment was he's like, I know all of your stuff. I know all of your money, all of your things that give you pleasure. He's like, I know those are the wall that stand between you and me. Jesus says, go get rid of every last bit of it. Go give it to the poor and come follow me. Jesus, to the point that he's making is, to whatever extreme it is, that whatever stands between you and that right relationship with him, then that thing is a problem. And a lot of times for us, that's us seeking all of these, the pleasures of the world. A lot of times that's what it is. And that stands between me and the relationship that I should have with him. And so James is saying, you keep going back, you're cheating. He's supposed to be it. You're supposed to be, solely dedicated to him. It's like what the words that are used here is basically like spiritual infidelity. He's like, you're going to something else and to someplace else when you're supposed to be with him. Again, that's an internal thing. That's a check my heart. Let's see where I'm at. Let's see where my focus is at. Because, again, focusing on those things leads me to problems with people. But man, it also messes up the relationship that I have with him. When we look at these things, when he talks about, friendship with the world, enmity with God, James says, he's like, don't you know? He's like, you guys should know these things already. He's like, don't you know these things? But he talks about having this friendship with the world. And that's not saying that we can't have any friends that aren't Christians. That's not what it's saying. Like, I'm friends with people that aren't Christians, but they're not my closest friends, just honestly. And my goal of my relationship with them is to be a testimony to Christ. I think that's my goal. But he talks about this friendship with the world. Again, it's not just non-Christian people. It means this friendship is adopting the values, the priorities, and the behaviors that are common in the world around us. Like we're just adopting the things of the world rather than living in the ways of God. A lot of the ways of the world and the ways of society are ultimately contrary to God's ways. So we don't adopt those ways. He says if we do adopt those things, that it puts us in a place of being in enmity with God. And that means is being in a bad place. That essentially is, like you said, making ourselves an enemy of his. Like, I don't mean enemy of anybody, but man, whew, like again, when we talk about the fear of God and who he is, do you really want to be an enemy of his? Like I do not want to be an enemy of God. James says that whoever wants to be this friend of the world, it's like you choose to put yourself at that moment in a place of being an enemy of his. He's like, God's like, you're on my side or you're not. It's like, is this for real or is this not? Is this a moment of spiritual infidelity or are you serious about who I am and this relationship that you have with me? God's the whole thing that he's trying. He's like, take the relationship you have with me seriously. That's like what verse 5 talks about. It says the Spirit of God that dwells within us, it yearns jealously. And normally we look at jealousy as this, obviously negative word. But when we speak of God's jealousy, you can see this all the way back into the Ten Commandments. All the way back in the Ten Commandments in Exodus. One of the commandments is, you shall not make an idol or an image or some carved thing, and you shall not bow down to it. You shall not worship it. You shall not serve it. You shall not do anything. And then it follows it up and it says, for I am the Lord your God and I am a jealous God. He's like, I don't want you looking at anyone else but me because I am your God. So that's like when the people of Israel, they made that golden calf. I mean, that was a crazy thing. Like they're literally getting the Ten Commandments because Moses is up on the mountain and there's fire and lightning and smoke and trumpets and like, yeah, let's make ourselves another God right now. Like that's ridiculous. But sometimes we do that junk. And it's just like find these things in our lives that I'm going to give this more attention than I'm going to give him more attention. And that could be a lot of things. That could be, I'm going to give me all of the attention and he's going to get a little bit. That could be, I'm going to give my kids all of the attention. Our kids can be a golden calf because they need to be led to, you need to see God. You need to see how important he is. I don't want you to feel like you're the most important thing in my life because I want you to know that he is the most important thing in my life. That could be a possession. It could be a house, a car. It could be the job that we have. It could be any of the things where we make these things idols and we put so much more effort into them that it deteriorates the relationship that I have with him. It says in here, the spirit inside of us yearns jealously. Because again, like it talks about in here, God doesn't want this, spiritual or whatever infidelity going on because he wants us completely. He saved us for that purpose. He made us his own for that purpose. But we see through all of these things, and we follow this down through, we understand just the seriousness that God looks at the relationship that he has with us with, the seriousness of that. And we just start talking about, how do we deal with these things? How do we deal with these issues that we're talking about? I look at verse 6 there and it says, but he gives more grace. Therefore he says, God resists the proud but gives grace to the humble. It's kind of a good news, bad news situation. He says he is gracious even in whatever position we're at right now. Maybe we're not in the right position. Maybe we have not been giving him the attention that he alone deserves. It says God still yet gives more grace. But good news, bad news. It's kind of good news, bad news, good news. He is gracious. But if we're too proud to start fixing any of these things, then he says God will oppose you. God will actively oppose you. Again, not the place I want to be. But good news, bad news, good news. But that if we humble ourselves, he says he has yet more grace to give. He's got grace where we're at right now. He gives us the opportunity. He's like telling us, fix the relationship. He's like, the relationship with me, that's the relationship you need to be worried about. If we humble ourselves and pursue that relationship, he says, I've got more grace to give you. Despite our issues with pride and with worldliness, God yet still has more grace. It says there, it says God gives grace to the humble. He says, submit to God. It says, therefore submit to God. That submission there, guys, if you remember, if you've read your book up to this point, we're going to be getting into chapter 3 soon, but the first 2 chapters of the book we've been reading, the men's group, it talks about this place where we see God as king. We see his kingdom as all of the authority that he has over everything. He is sovereignly in control. And then to be a kingdom man or this man of God, it's like, he's king, I'm putting myself under the command of the king. I'm aligning myself under the command of the king. When it says, therefore submit to God, that's the idea. It's alignment under God. Align yourselves under the king. That's a men and women thing. We all need to align ourselves under the king. And the key to that is humility. If I think I've got it, if I think I'm making this all about myself, if I'm just, plowing my own path and it's not about him, I'm not humble in that moment. Humility is I'm bringing myself under him and let his power, his word, his control, his perspective, his word guide the path, guide the next step that I'm taking from here. When you see these verses, it says, therefore submit to God. Align yourself under the king. It says, resist the devil and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Lament and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned to mourning and your joy to gloom. Humble yourselves in the sight of the Lord and he will lift you up. We see humility is the key to all of these things. When we're in that alignment under his power and his authority, when we're aligned under the king, then we can resist the devil and he will flee. Not because I'm powerful, but because I am under the king's authority. I'm under the king's power. The king is the one that's watching over the situation. When I'm aligned under him, okay, let's resist with the flesh. Let's resist what the devil's putting out there. Because I know that he's got this. And I will be actively involved in the process of, I don't want anything to do with these things. But at the end of the day, I know the king's got this. He's the one. His authority is what's making the devil flee. But we need to be aligned under him. In alignment under him, when we draw closer to God, he draws closer in relationship to us. So if we fill so much of our time with other things, but he's like, when you get in the right position with me, when you choose to draw closer to me, he's like, I will draw right in close to you. Because he wants that relationship with us. But if we're out of alignment and we're chasing after every last thing, it's like we're the ones moving away from him when his desire is to be moving in close to us. But he says, come to me and I'll come close to you. He talks here about dealing with our sin. And maybe we still, maybe we're still holding on to sin. Maybe there's things we haven't dealt with. When James talks about these things, he says, cleanse your hands, purify your hearts. He says, lament and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned to mourning and your joy to gloom. You might sit here and say, well, I don't want to be, not laughing and gloomy. And I don't want to have to mourn and weep. What he's saying there is this acknowledge the seriousness of our sin. Sin is that wedge that is going to stop us being close to him in relationship. When we let that sin stay in there, it just widens the gap. We're not going to be in proper alignment under him if we're, habitually sinning in some way, because at that point we are helping the flesh win. We're giving in. We're not moving into the position that we're supposed to be in. So James is looking at these things. He's like, you need to feel the weight and the problem of your sin. Because if we don't, then we're not going to deal with it and get in that right alignment under him. He says we need to actually feel these things and not just have some superficial regret, I had these sins. No, like, man, Scripture says, it says when David was talking, I believe it was David, but there's a talk of his sin and even things that he's done to other people. But at the end of the day, he's talking to God. And he says, against you and you alone have I sinned. And you can feel just the gravity that he felt in, like, man, even the dumb choices that I've made, even towards other people, ultimately have been choices that I've made against God. James is saying, feel that. And this isn't some superficial thing. Feel it. Deal with it. Hopefully feel it to such a point that you're not going back there anymore. Again, James is calling us to check our hearts. But through all of this, once again, just as we close, as we think about the relationship problems that we have with people, how it leads to even bigger relationship problems that we have with God. When we talk about how do we deal with these things? Humble, humility. It's putting ourselves, like I said, just right under him in alignment. And maybe there's other aspects. Maybe it's like, I need to humble my prideful perspective that I walk around with as I look at other people. Maybe I need to humble my life and not be chasing after all of these random other things that are getting me caught up. It's like maybe I need to do all of these other things, but ultimately it's the humility under him. And I think of the, when Jesus was saying, well, how do you sum up for what's the most important commandment? And Jesus said, love your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. And you see that. God says, I want you to love me with everything. I want you to love other people too. Those are meant to be happening in parallel at all times, because when we're having those relationship problems, like as James is talking about, say, when we're having those relationship problems with people around us, ultimately it's relating to relationship problems with God himself. And Jesus says, these are the two main things you need to be worried about. But sometimes, and usually, as James is talking about today, he's like, look inside and see what's causing it. Like, what is drawing us towards these problems? Is it, I'm just caught up in seeking all of these pleasures? Is there's a certain life that I'm wanting to live? Is it this? Is it that? Like, what's inside of me that is stopping me from being at peace with people and in the right place with God? Because it's not God. It's a perspective issue. So, again, as we walk away today, God says we can't be friends with the world and friends with him at the same time. Jesus says you can't love me, you can't love money at the same time. It's like, all these different things. James is so clear that it's these fleshly desires for worldly things that lead people to have these relationship problems, and even worse, to have God relationship problems. And right along with that, very likely money problems, stress problems, keeping up with the Joneses problems, plenty of other problems that could come with wanting the things of the world. James tells us to humble ourselves under him, to get our hands and our hearts back to the right place. And it tells us that God will lift us up. It's an interesting statement. The lifting up that it talks about there is an understanding that we should have. That the greatest honor available to a person is an honor that comes from God. It's not from worldly achievements. It's not from the recognition of other people or any of these things. He tells us that we live this way. We live in alignment with him. We pursue relationship with him. We grow in those ways. And he says that God will honor or exalt us in his time and in his way. And for us, that should matter more than anything else in this world. Do you really want people to think about you some sort of way? I mean, we do. We want to have a positive outlook, or people have a positive outlook on us. But at the end of this life, I want God to have that, again, that moment of well done, good and faithful servant. Like you have had that relationship with me. You have lived for me. This has been real. But as James is challenging us to this morning, do we love him enough to see past our fleshly wants and begin taking the steps necessary to live the life that he has called us to live? Do we love him enough to do that? Something to go think about. Let's pray.